Okay, so we're now going to go actually through the process of preparing a cutting and putting it into a pot. So if you remember, we took some cuttings of the fuchsia at the other end of the garden, and I said that we need to put them inside a plastic bag. And that's really important because plants at this time of the year are losing moisture all the time, and we need to preserve the moisture in the plants until they've got time to make their roots. So we put them in preferably a translucent plastic bag if you can. I've put a little drop of water in this as well, just to keep it a little bit moist in there as well. So I'm now going to untie this bag, and I'm going to show you how to actually prepare the cuttings before it goes into the compost. So I'm just going to take one of these cuttings out. Okay, and I'm going to lay it onto the tile. Now, I just need to point out a couple of features on a plant that we need to be careful of and consideration of when we take cuttings. And that is this part of the stem here and this part of the stem here. This is what we call the internode, the stem. And this is what we call the node. This is where the leaves join the main stem. And the reason why that's important is because this is where we're going to take the cutting. So we've taken it off the plant as a whole piece, but we're now going to do what we call preparing the cutting before sticking it into the compost. So, knife in one hand, just gently hold the cutting, and we're going to make a cut below the node, not through the node, but just below it, and remove that piece of material. Now you can pick this off with your finger and thumbnail if you've got sharp nails. What I prefer to do is just turn it through 90 degrees, just lay it down, hold it gently, and I'm going to take off this bottom leaf and the little bit of growth that's alongside it on both sides. Now when you become very proficient at this, you can do this very quickly, but speed isn't the key here, just kind of being very thorough about it. So now we've got a long cutting, and the trouble with this now is that this plant is going to lose moisture through all of these leaves, and we need to reduce what's called the transpiration loss, the loss of moisture. So what I'm now going to do, which looks a bit alarming, is to cut that bit of the stem and take that away as well. And then we're left with that as our cutting. Now you'll notice that I'm handling it, if I can, at most times by the leaf rather than the stem. If I'm squashing the stem, that's potentially damaging that potential to root. And the other thing I might do in this case, because the size of the leaves is quite large, I might actually cut the leaves in half again to reduce that moisture loss. So holding it along the tile, a nice sharp cut, and remove those leaves. And there's my cutting. That's a perfectly fine little softwood cutting of a fuchsia. So now I'm going to show you how to put it into the pot. So here's our pot. Now what you mustn't do, because this is quite vulnerable material, you mustn't just push that cutting into the compost. You need to make a hole for it to go into. Now what I didn't show you earlier was this tool, which is a dibber. This is to make the hole for the cutting to go in, but you can, if you don't have a dibber, use the pencil. So I'll show you how to do that. So I would probably try to get 4 or 5 decent cuttings into a pot this size, but I'm just going to show you how to do it by putting it straight in the middle. So we make a little hole with the pencil into the moist compost, put the cutting in, and then we're going to push the compost up against the cutting to firm it in. Now it's important that it shouldn't be able to be drawn straight out. It should be firmly in there, but what you mustn't be doing is compressing the compost too much. We need air around the roots in order for it to air around the stem in order for it to make roots. So that's our fuchsia cutting, a little softwood cutting. And then to preserve it until it's produced its roots, we're then going to put it inside a little enclosed turgid environment, a moisture saturated environment. We've got moisture from the compost, and we're going to put this bag over the top of it, scrunch it up so that we've got a little tent, and I'm going to secure that with the elastic band. And I just do that by pushing over the bottom like that and then closing it. And there we go, and that's our perfectly fine little cutting.
How long would you leave that, Gary?
Well, you need to leave that for probably 4 to 6 weeks actually for it to root properly. What you mustn't be doing is taking the bag off and trying to pull that cutting out to see if it's produced roots. As soon as you do that, you've lost most of the opportunity for it to root. So you just need to gently look at it. You should notice that it will start to steam up inside the bag as the moisture from the compost hits the inside of the bag and then drops back down. That's perfect environment. It needs to go somewhere where it's in light but not direct sunlight. It mustn't be getting too hot now. So a nice windowsill that doesn't face west or south is perfect.
Do I have to do I have to water it again?
You just need to have a little look at the compost. If the compost is dried out too much, give it a gentle water, but what you mustn't do is soak it. Okay, don't forget that cutting hasn't yet got any roots, so it can't move water away from itself. Okay, so I'm now going to show you how to take a few more cuttings. I'm going to come back to this one, which is the geranium, and I'm just going to show you where I'm going to take the cutting, because every plant has got slightly different stems, and I'm going to take a cutting from this portion here. This is a nice potential cutting. I'm going to remove it gently, so I'm going to hold the material above the cut and cut through it with my knife, like so. Now, this is often the case with plants at this time of the year. This has actually got a flower coming on it. This is the flower here. So the first thing I need to do is I need to lay that on the bench and cut that flower off, which might seem quite horrifying, but don't forget we're producing plants for free here. We don't want a flower on this at the moment. So I'm going to lay it onto my tile, and cut it using my knife and remove the flower. Now, pelargoniums and geraniums have a very particular kind of structure on their flower, on their plant rather, on the stem, and this is this thing here. I mean, you just need to remove those because they are the things which have the potential to rot, and that will stop the plant from producing roots. And then if you remember, we need to remove the leaves. So here's the node, just where the leaf joins the stem. I'm going to cut through that. And then I'm going to take all the bottom leaves off because again they have the potential to rot, and that will prevent the plant from producing roots. Now in here we've got some little potential plants emerging, some leaves emerging, so again just with your thumb and forefinger just remove those, and that's a perfectly good little pelargonium cutting out of pot. You should never really put a different plant, a different cutting plant, into the same pot. So for each plant you should have a separate pot. I'm going to use my dibber this time. Nice hole in, tuck it up, put a tap on the bench, and then ordinarily I would have another bag and I would cover that over.
Can I put more than one cutting in a pot?
You can put more than one cutting in a pot. And in fact, if I was doing this on a commercial basis, I'd probably have half a dozen plants in there, which seems a bit extraordinary. But there's actually some thinking that actually the plants touching each other is beneficial to their rooting. So yes, I would probably put 4 or 5 more plants in that pot that size, but I wouldn't have put it in the middle. I would have spaced them around the side. And then I'm just going to show you how to do cutting from this plant, and this is Bacopa. And again, remember we're looking for non-flowering plant material, so we've got lots of flowers coming on. If you look here, this is a nice little stem here. I'm going to take this one. Now this one is very soft and delicate, so you need to be a bit careful. So you need to reach in, take the cutting material, take it off the plant, and out the way. So if you remember, into node and the node, and we're going to cut below the node. Nice cut, remove the stem, and then we're just going to take those bottom leaves off. And I would probably take that little bit of growth off the top as well. So a much kind of smaller, delicate kind of cutting. Now this is an example where probably you could get at least 10 of these little cuttings into this pot. So I'm just going to dip it. If I was going to do 10, I'd do them around the outside of the pot like this. Put it in, tuck it up. And in the same way I would put a white plastic bag over the top.
What would you expect the strike rate to be?
I think given the fact you're getting these plants for free, I would be very happy with a 50% strike rate. We're not running a commercial nursery here, but a commercial nursery they would expect 80% plus. And that's really down to the skill of the propagator, the time of year and the type of material. And that's worthwhile considering. If you have a look back at this plant, a really good plant is a plant which is well watered, juvenile in its growth, in other words it's not old, and also pest and disease free. And if you can maintain plants which are pest and disease free and they're in their juvenile stage, then your success rate and your strike rate is much greater. Okay, I'm just going to show you now. There's another plant just behind us here, which is a commoner garden sage, and this is a lovely herb. We use it a lot in our kitchen, and I just want to show you how you might take a plant material from this plant. So I'm going to reach in here and I'm just going to take a piece of material. Now I'm going to do this with my knife rather than a pair of secateurs. I'm just going to take it off the plant, and we have a piece of material like that. I'll just take it across to the bench. Move that one out of the way. Now, this is quite a good example here because this salvia is quite an old plant actually, and actually if I just show you how woody this end of the stem is, it's still quite woody. It's no longer soft. That's because that's an older piece of material. So I'm looking for this portion up here, which was much more pliable. So I'm going to take my cutting. I can now afford to remove that bit there, so I'm going to cut it below the node there, discard that, and then take these bottom leaves off. Now the other thing with this one is that we've got a lot of leaf area here. This is potentially losing lots of moisture. So if you remember, what we do is we cut down the transpiration loss by removing the leaves. And then I might even cut that in half as well. And there's our little salvia cutting. And then we'll just dip that one into this pot here.
How will I know if the cutting's been successful?
That's a very good question, because actually quite a lot of plant material will start to grow from this point and you'll think, hooray, I've managed to strike a cutting. Don't be tempted though. The only real way in which you can tell is if you look underneath the pot and you've got roots emerging. That's the best indicator. What you mustn't be doing is being tempted, as I said before, to start doing this kind of business, because as soon as you break that connection between the stem of the cutting and the compost it's in, then it won't root.
So just to be clear, if once I've taken my cuttings, if I leave them in the right position with the polythene on, I check to make sure that they're not too wet and they're not too dry, and then I check the bottom of the pot, and as soon as I can see roots, I can then know that it's been successful.
Correct. And then what you need to do is you then need to remove those individual plants from the pot and pot them up individually, and keep them going again for a little bit longer so that they themselves produce roots in a pot. It's too much of a risk to plant a newly established cutting straight out into a border. So the reason why this is such a good thing to do at this time of the year is because if you don't have a glass house or you don't have masses of space to keep these tender plants frost free, it's much easier to keep a small collection of cuttings till next year when you can then pot them up outside.
And to be clear, that plant that you have now came from a cutting?
Yes. Yep. And these did as well. So that's from a cutting which is probably about 8, 10, 12 weeks old probably. So I think we took cuttings of this just at lockdown, so it's doing very well. And that will keep going right through the summer, producing lots of lovely flowers. And as you can see, lots of potential new cuttings. There's probably, if I was running my nursery as I once did, I'd probably get another 20 plants off of that. I'd be quite happy to do so.